Robert Oppenheimer was not born into war, politics, or power. He was born into thought. Long before his name would be spoken in government chambers and whispered in intelligence files, he was a quiet child surrounded by books, languages, and ideas that reached far beyond his age. His family valued culture over authority, curiosity over obedience. From the beginning, Oppenheimer learned to question, to analyze, and to feel deeply about the consequences of knowledge. This emotional depth would later define his brilliance and ultimately seal his fate. As he grew older, Oppenheimer's mind revealed itself as something rare even among geniuses. He was not merely intelligent. He was absorbent. He could move between poetry and physics, philosophy and mathematics, without seeing borders between them. Where others specialized, Oppenheimer synthesized. He believed knowledge was interconnected, and that understanding one truth required respecting many others. In academic circles, this made him magnetic. In political circles, it would one day make him dangerous. By the 1930s, the world was cracking. Economic collapse, the rise of fascism in Europe, and the growing brutality of authoritarian regimes disturbed many American intellectuals. Like countless professors, scientists, and writers of his generation, Oppenheimer explored left-leaning ideas, not out of loyalty to any foreign power, but out of fear of where unchecked nationalism and inequality could lead. He attended gatherings. He donated modest sums. He listened. At the time, these actions were neither secret nor illegal. They were part of a broader moral debate unfolding across universities worldwide. But history has a way of reinterpreting context after fear takes hold. When World War II erupted, theory collided with reality. Reports emerged suggesting Nazi Germany might be attempting to harness nuclear fission as a weapon. The implications were apocalyptic. A single bomb, capable of leveling entire cities, could decide the war and the future of civilization itself. The United States government faced a terrifying dilemma: either build such a weapon first, or risk living in a world where someone else controlled it. The Manhattan Project was launched under layers of secrecy so deep that even many within the government barely understood its scope. It was not just a scientific effort, it was an industrial, military, and psychological race against time. Thousands of people, billions of dollars, and the full weight of American urgency were mobilized. What the project needed most, however, was leadership that could unite chaos into precision. Oppenheimer was not the obvious choice. He had never run a massive laboratory. He lacked military credentials, and quietly some officials questioned his political past. But General Leslie Groves saw something others overlooked. Groves understood that the bomb would not be built by obedience alone. It would be built by persuasion, by convincing fiercely independent scientists to cooperate under unimaginable pressure. Oppenheimer, with his intensity, clarity, and intellectual empathy, was uniquely suited to this role. Once appointed, Oppenheimer transformed Los Alamos into more than a research facility. It became a crucible of ideas, fear, exhaustion, and moral tension. Scientists worked around the clock, knowing that their calculations might end a war or redefine death itself. Oppenheimer walked among them constantly, absorbing problems, resolving disputes, encouraging breakthroughs. He remembered equations, personalities, and doubts with equal care. To many, he became the embodiment of the project itself. Yet even at the height of his authority, Oppenheimer was not blind to the cost. He understood that the atomic bomb was not simply another weapon in history's long arsenal. It was a rupture, a force that could not be uninvented, a threshold humanity would cross only once. While others focused on success, Oppenheimer wrestled with consequence. He read ancient texts late into the night. He reflected on responsibility in ways that made his silence heavier than any speech. When the Trinity test finally ignited the desert sky, the world changed in a fraction of a second. The explosion was both triumph and terror. Some celebrated. Others stood in stunned quiet. Oppenheimer did not cheer. He later recalled ancient words describing the destruction of worlds not as drama, but as realization. He knew that victory had come at a price humanity had never paid before. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war ended swiftly. The United States emerged as the dominant nuclear power. Oppenheimer was hailed as a hero, his image appearing in newspapers and magazines as the man who helped end the war. Presidents sought his counsel. Committees listened when he spoke. For a brief moment his voice carried weight, not just in laboratories, but in the shaping of global policy. But the world did not rest. Almost immediately, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union collapsed into suspicion. The Cold War began not with bullets, but with fear. Nuclear weapons were no longer wartime necessities. They were instruments of deterrence, leverage, and dominance. And as military planners pushed for faster, bigger, more destructive weapons, Oppenheimer hesitated. He questioned whether endless escalation made the world safer. He argued that atomic energy required restraint, cooperation, and moral clarity. He opposed the rapid development of the hydrogen bomb, warning that its destructive capacity crossed a line that humanity might never return from. These were not radical statements. They were measured ethical concerns. But in an age of fear, caution sounded like resistance. Slowly, subtly, the atmosphere around Oppenheimer changed. His past associations were no longer historical footnotes. They became points of suspicion. His moral objections were no longer philosophical. They were framed as obstacles. Allies grew distant. Conversations became formal. Files were reopened. Loyalty, once proven by service, was now measured by silence and compliance. Oppenheimer sensed the shift, but underestimated its force. He believed reason would prevail. He believed his wartime contributions spoke louder than whispers. He believed that America, having trusted him with its most terrible secret, would trust his conscience as well. He did not yet understand that the nation he helped protect was transforming, and that the space for dissent, even principled dissent, was rapidly disappearing. The punishment that awaited him would not be immediate. It would unfold slowly, methodically, wrapped in procedure and patriotism. There would be no public arrest, no dramatic accusation. Instead, there would be a hearing, a questioning of loyalty, a dismantling of reputation, and the quiet message that even the architects of victory could become liabilities in a world ruled by fear. And as the Cold War hardened, the man who once stood at the center of America's greatest achievement began to realize that he was no longer trusted, not because he betrayed his country, but because he dared to think beyond its fear. As the world slid deeper into the Cold War, the United States underwent a quiet transformation. The enemy was no longer visible on battlefields. It existed in shadows, ideologies, and suspicions. Loyalty was no longer proven by sacrifice alone. It was demanded through conformity. In this new climate, fear became policy, and paranoia became protection. It was within this atmosphere that Robert Oppenheimer's fate began to harden. The same government that once celebrated his brilliance now viewed him through a different lens. His hesitation about nuclear escalation, once respected as intellectual caution, was increasingly interpreted as obstruction. His calls for international control of atomic weapons were no longer seen as visionary. They were labeled naive, even dangerous. In a time when dominance was equated with survival, restraint was treated as betrayal. Oppenheimer found himself surrounded by conversations that felt colder, more formal. Meetings once filled with open debate now carried unspoken boundaries. Words were weighed. Silences were noted, and behind closed doors, files were quietly thickening. Past associations, long dormant, were being re-examined with ruthless precision. Names he once knew casually were now underlined in red ink. The political machine driving this shift was relentless. Congressional committees expanded their reach, hunting not just spies but sympathies. The question was no longer whether someone had acted against the United States, but whether they might someday do so. Intent replaced action. Suspicion replaced evidence. And in this environment, nuance became dangerous. Oppenheimer's earlier involvement with left-leaning circles was dragged into the present as if frozen in time. Context was stripped away. The moral debates of the 1930s were reinterpreted through the lens of post-war fear. His friendships were no longer human connections, they were liabilities. His curiosity about political ideas was reframed as ideological weakness. What made the situation particularly painful was that Oppenheimer did not hide. He answered questions openly. He did not deny his past. He believed honesty would protect him. That truth still mattered in a system he had served faithfully. This belief, however noble, underestimated the emotional momentum of the era. Fear does not negotiate. It demands certainty, and when certainty is impossible, it invents guilt. As tensions with the Soviet Union intensified, the development of the hydrogen bomb became a central issue. Unlike the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb promised destruction on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Oppenheimer opposed its rapid development, not because he doubted America's right to defend itself, but because he feared what such a weapon would mean for humanity. He argued that some thresholds once crossed could never be uncrossed. This opposition placed him directly in conflict with powerful figures who believed absolute strength was the only language enemies understood. To them, Oppenheimer's resistance was not moral courage, it was strategic vulnerability. His influence over scientific policy became a threat rather than an asset. And in Washington, threats are neutralized, not debated. The decision to formally investigate Oppenheimer's loyalty did not arrive with dramatic announcements. It came quietly through procedural language and administrative steps. A security review, a reassessment, words that sounded neutral, even reasonable, but beneath them lay a singular intent to determine whether the man who once shaped America's nuclear future could still be trusted to influence it. The hearing that followed was not a trial in the traditional sense. There was no jury, no presumption of innocence. It was an inquiry designed to evaluate character rather than crime. Witnesses were called, some reluctantly, others eagerly. Old colleagues, former friends, and professional rivals found themselves testifying about Oppenheimer's past, his statements, his demeanor. Loyalty was dissected as if it were a measurable substance. For Oppenheimer, the experience was devastating. He had spent his life among ideas, not accusations. Now his words were being used against him, his hesitations interpreted as evidence, his moral concerns reframed as disloyalty. The room was not filled with hatred. It was filled with cold procedure. And that made it worse. There was no villain to confront, only a system doing exactly what it believed necessary. Some witnesses defended him passionately, reminding the panel of his wartime service, his leadership, and his unquestionable contribution to national security. Others spoke ambiguously, distancing themselves, careful not to attach their own reputations to a man already under suspicion. Silence, too, became a form of testimony. In the Cold War, neutrality was dangerous. What hurt Oppenheimer most was not the accusation itself, but the realization that trust had evaporated. The same government that once entrusted him with secrets capable of ending civilizations now questioned whether he deserved access to policy discussions. It was not that he had failed America, it was that America no longer tolerated doubt. Throughout the process, Oppenheimer remained composed, but the strain was visible. Friends noticed the weight in his posture, the quiet exhaustion behind his eyes. He was fighting not to prove innocence, he was fighting to preserve meaning, to assert that conscience still had a place in power, that reflection was not weakness, that intelligence carried responsibility beyond obedience. The verdict, when it came, was framed as administrative necessity. His security clearance was revoked. He was not imprisoned. He was not publicly disgraced. Instead, he was effectively removed from influence. His voice, once central to national debate, was reduced to an echo. The punishment was subtle but complete. This was not revenge. It was erasure. Oppenheimer was allowed to remain a scientist, a professor, a thinker, but never again a decision-maker. The message was clear. Brilliance is valuable only when it aligns. Questioning the direction of power, even from a place of loyalty, would not be tolerated. As the Cold War marched forward, the hydrogen bomb was built. Nuclear arsenals expanded. Deterrence became doctrine. And Oppenheimer watched from the margins, a man who helped open a door he no longer had the authority to warn against. The punishment he endured was not about what he did. It was about what he represented. A reminder that intelligence without compliance can be perceived as danger. That moral hesitation in an age of fear is often the first casualty. And though the hearings ended, the consequences lingered. Not just for Oppenheimer, but for every scientist, thinker, and advisor who watched and learned the cost of speaking too carefully or too honestly. After the hearing ended, life did not collapse around Robert Oppenheimer. It narrowed. There were no dramatic scenes, no public shaming in the streets. Instead, there was a quiet withdrawal of invitations, a noticeable absence of phone calls, a slow fading of relevance. Power rarely announces when it is done with you. It simply stops listening. Oppenheimer returned to academic life, but something fundamental had changed. He was still respected in theory, still admired for his intellect, but the center of gravity had moved away from him. Decisions were now made without his voice, policies formed without his caution. The rooms where the future was shaped no longer included his presence. At the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, he walked familiar paths with a new awareness of distance. Students still listened. Colleagues still spoke politely. But the unspoken truth hung in the air. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Not a legal line, but a political one. In the age of suspicion, perception mattered more than contribution. The loss of influence weighed heavier than any official punishment. Oppenheimer had never sought power for its own sake. He believed knowledge carried responsibility, and responsibility demanded participation. Being excluded from the conversation felt like being asked to watch a fire burn while your hands were tied, knowing you helped build the match. Privately, the guilt never left him. He spoke often of the moment the first atomic bomb detonated, of the words that came to his mind from ancient texts about destruction and consequence. Those words followed him into old age, not as a declaration of pride, but as a warning he felt humanity had ignored. What troubled him most was not that weapons continued to exist, but that they had become normalized. The bomb was no longer an emergency measure. It was a permanent fixture of global strategy. Entire doctrines were now built around the assumption that mass destruction would prevent war rather than invite it. Oppenheimer feared this logic was fragile and that one failure of restraint could unravel everything. Yet restraint was no longer fashionable. During public appearances, he chose his words carefully. Too careful, some said. Others claimed he had become withdrawn, even defeated. But those who knew him understood something deeper. He was guarding the last thing he had left, his integrity. If he could no longer shape policy, he would at least refuse to simplify the truth. History, however, has a long memory. As decades passed and the Cold War evolved, the fear that once defined the era began to soften. Documents were declassified. Testimonies were re-examined. The urgency that justified extreme measures slowly gave way to reflection. And in that reflection, Oppenheimer's story began to look different. He was no longer viewed as a potential risk, but as an early voice of caution, one who understood the power humanity had unleashed before it fully grasped the consequences. His opposition to unchecked escalation no longer seemed naive. It seemed prescient. The same traits that once endangered his position hesitation, moral reflection, intellectual humility were now recognized as virtues that had been suppressed rather than answered. The system had not proven him wrong. It had simply outpaced him. Near the end of his life, recognition returned in quieter ways. Honors were offered. Words of respect were spoken. But time does not reverse erasure. Apologies delivered too late still arrive after the damage is done. Oppenheimer accepted these gestures without bitterness, but also without illusion. He understood that institutions rarely admit fault in the moment. They correct the record only when it is safe to do so, when the lesson no longer threatens power. What remains of Oppenheimer today is not just the image of a scientist haunted by his creation, but the story of a man caught between loyalty and conscience. He was punished not for betrayal, but for insisting that intelligence without ethics was incomplete. His life stands as a warning that societies often celebrate brilliance only until it questions direction, that builders of power are welcomed, but critics of its use are feared, and that the most dangerous ideas are not those that threaten enemies, but those that force a nation to look at itself. In the end, Oppenheimer did not lose his legacy. It evolved. He is remembered not only as the father of the atomic bomb, but as one of the first to truly understand what that title meant and to fear it. And perhaps that is the quiet tragedy of his story, that the man who helped give the world unprecedented power was sidelined precisely because he understood it too well. Time does something power cannot. It slows the noise. It peels away urgency. It allows motives to be examined without fear breathing down the neck of every decision. And as the decades moved forward, history began to revisit Robert Oppenheimer, not as a threat, not as a suspect, but as a mirror. The world Oppenheimer had warned about arrived gradually. Nuclear weapons multiplied. Nations built arsenals not to use, but to display. Entire generations were born under the assumption that annihilation was a permanent possibility, hovering silently above everyday life. The bomb was no longer shocking. It was strategic, and that normalization, more than anything, validated the fears Oppenheimer had voiced when few were ready to listen. As scholars and historians re-examined the Cold War, the question shifted. It was no longer, was Oppenheimer loyal? But what did loyalty demand at that moment in history? The hearings that once appeared procedural began to look punitive. The evidence that once seemed compelling now appeared circumstantial, and the distinction between dissent and disloyalty became clearer with distance. Oppenheimer's punishment was not born from malice. It was born from fear, a fear that moral hesitation might slow military advantage, a fear that openness might invite vulnerability, a fear that questioning power could weaken resolve. In that climate, silencing a conscience felt like safeguarding a nation. But history rarely rewards fear. The late 20th century, the narrative had shifted. Declassified records revealed the internal disagreements, the political pressures, the personal rivalries that influenced decisions once framed as purely security-based. Oppenheimer's objections to the hydrogen bomb were no longer fringe, they were shared, privately, by others who chose silence over consequence. The realization was uncomfortable. The system had not been protecting itself from Oppenheimer. It had been protecting itself from doubt. In symbolic recognition of this truth, the United States government eventually moved to restore his reputation. Official statements acknowledged that the process used against him was flawed, shaped more by Cold War anxiety than by evidence of wrongdoing. It was a quiet correction, long overdue. There was no ceremony that could return his influence, no speech that could erase years of exclusion. But the acknowledgment mattered not for Oppenheimer, who was long gone, but for the record of history. What remains today is a story larger than one man. Oppenheimer represents the cost of conscience in moments of crisis. He reminds us that societies under threat often narrow their definition of loyalty until it excludes reflection, that those who build the most powerful tools are often least trusted to question their use, and that moral clarity in times of fear is frequently punished before it is understood. His life forces an uncomfortable truth that being right too early can be indistinguishable from being wrong. That caution can be misread as weakness, and that history often redeems voices only after they can no longer influence outcomes. Yet Oppenheimer's legacy endures not as a warning against science, but as a plea for responsibility. He believed knowledge without wisdom was incomplete, that power without restraint was dangerous, and that humanity's greatest breakthroughs carried obligations equal to their potential. In the end, he was not punished because he opposed his country. He was punished because he loved it enough to challenge where it was going. And perhaps that is the final lesson of his story, that progress without reflection leads to repetition, that fear silences those we need most, and that the quiet voices urging restraint are often the ones history thanks, long after they have been ignored. Robert Oppenheimer did not betray the United States. He warned it, and in doing so, he paid the price of being heard too late.